This story is titled, My Parents Didn't Help Me with My Studies, so they bought a new car for $55,000 for my sister. And then, when I became successful, they came to lend money for her wedding, after they didn't help me. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's video, big news! I've launched a new Reddit channel. This time, the background isn't Minecraft. It's Subway Surfers in a Christmas theme to match the season. Check it out, subscribe, and join the fun. Links in the description. See you there. Now let's start the video. I thought my family was alright. Not great, not terrible. Just average, you know? Growing up, my parents, Linda and Mark, didn't spoil us. But they weren't cruel either. Or at least, that's what I thought. Things were manageable. We had food on the table, clothes that fit, and the occasional vacation to somewhere like a local lake or campground. Nothing fancy, but enough to feel like we were doing okay. All that changed when I turned 18 and got into med school. I'd worked my ass off in high school to make this happen, sacrificing weekends and summer breaks to study, volunteer, and do everything they said would look good on a med school application. And it paid off. I got into a solid program. And yeah, I was stoked. I remember sitting at the dinner table that night, the acceptance letter in my hand. I got in, I said, unable to keep the grin off my face. I just need some help with tuition. I'll pay you guys back once I'm working. Promise. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. He just kept cutting his meat like I hadn't said anything at all. Mom gave me one of her tired looks, the kind she usually reserved for when I asked for gas money, or an extra $10 for school supplies. We can't help you, Eric, Dad finally said. Money's tight right now. I blinked. Tight? I knew we weren't swimming in cash, but tight. You helped Ashley last year with her tuition, I pointed out. My voice wasn't even angry, just confused. What changed? Mom didn't even hesitate. Your sister needed help, she said simply. And we have other priorities now. Ashley, my older sister, sat across the table scrolling on her phone, acting like she wasn't part of this conversation. She didn't even glance up, and for some reason, that made me feel worse. That night, I tried to brush it off. I told myself they were stressed, that maybe they really were struggling. But 2 days later, Dad came home with a brand new Jeep Grand Cherokee. Not for him, for Ashley. When I say brand new, I mean brand new. Leather seats, fancy tech, the whole deal. And I heard Dad telling a neighbor it cost $55,000. I stared at it parked in the driveway like it was mocking. I couldn't believe it. They had other priorities, huh? Apparently, those priorities included making sure Ashley had a flashy car to cruise around town. Meanwhile, I was supposed to figure out how to pay for med school on my own. That night, I sat in my room staring at my acceptance letter. The excitement I'd felt just days earlier was gone, replaced by this sinking feeling in my chest. I thought about giving up on med school entirely. It wasn't like I could afford it, and clearly, my family wasn't going to help. But then I thought, screw it. If they weren't going to invest in me, I just have to invest in myself. The next morning, I started looking for jobs. Anything that would pay me enough to save for tuition. I applied everywhere. Restaurants, retail, delivery services. It was depressing, honestly. After spending years working toward med school, I was now competing for minimum wage jobs. I finally landed a position at a warehouse. That night, I collapsed onto my bed, too tired to even eat. But despite the exhaustion, there was this stubborn part of me that felt proud. I was doing it. I was taking care of myself, even if it sucked. What got under my skin was the way my parents acted like Ashley's success was a given, while I was just some afterthought. You're learning the value of hard work, Dad said one evening when I came home covered in dust and sweat. Hard work? I wanted to yell. I was breaking my back every day while Ashley was handed everything on a silver platter. But I didn't say anything. What was the point? One night, as I sat in my room doing homework, I heard Dad talking on the phone in the other room. He was bragging about Ashley's Jeep to someone, going on about how she deserved it for being so responsible. I slammed my textbook shut and left the house for a walk, needing to cool down. Responsible? Ashley didn't even have a part-time job. She was coasting through life, and they were rewarding her for it. Meanwhile, I was out here working like crazy, and all I got was silence. But that silence taught me something. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their money either. All I needed was to keep my head down and get through this. Looking back, that realization was the turning point. It didn't make things easier, but it gave me a sense of purpose. If they didn't think I was worth it, fine. I'd prove them wrong. Getting into med school felt like the big win I'd been chasing for years. But the reality of how I'd get there hit me like a brick the minute I stepped into the warehouse for my first full shift. Let me tell you, if you've never spent 10 hours lugging boxes, sweating through your clothes, And dodging forklifts? You're not missing much. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even decent, but it was a job, and it paid enough for me to scrape by while saving for school. The warehouse was this huge, loud space filled with rows of shelving that seemed to stretch forever. The air always felt thick with dust, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed nonstop. The work was grueling. I spent most of my day unloading delivery trucks and stacking boxes that sometimes weighed more than I did. My first week, I thought my arms were going to fall off. By the end of each shift, my hands were raw, my legs felt like jelly, and my back. Don't even get me started on my back. It was the kind of pain that didn't go away after a hot shower or a night's sleep. It just stayed, like a constant reminder of how hard I was pushing myself. And the warehouse wasn't just physically draining, it was mentally exhausting too. The managers barked orders all day, always watching, ready to pounce if you were even a little slow. I'd hear stuff like, "Pick up the pace, Eric. Those boxes aren't going to move themselves," on repeat. Some days I wondered if they even saw us as people or just machines they could yell at to get more work done. Still, I didn't complain. I couldn't. I needed that paycheck to cover my tuition and basic expenses. Complaining wouldn't make the boxes any lighter or the shifts any shorter. What made it worse was going home after a long day with my shoes coated in dirt and my muscles screaming for a break, and seeing Ashley in her usual spot, lounging on the couch or scrolling on her phone in the kitchen, completely unbothered. Mom and Dad? They acted like everything was normal, like me busting my ass in a warehouse was just part of the natural order of things. "You're doing good, Eric," Dad said one evening, not even looking up from his TV. "Hard work builds character." Character. Yeah, okay. Meanwhile, Ashley was upstairs snapping selfies in designer clothes and talking about her weekend plans. It felt like a slap in the face every single day, but I didn't say anything. I'd learned that arguing with them never led anywhere. They'd just brush me off or find a way to twist things around. The routine started to feel like a prison. I'd wake up at 5 a.m., choke down some instant coffee, and head to the warehouse. I'd spend my day hauling boxes, trying to avoid injuries or getting chewed out by the supervisor. After work, I'd rush to community college for night classes, barely staying awake through lectures. By the time I got home, it was usually close to midnight. There wasn't time for anything else. No social life, no hobbies, no sleep, just work, school, repeat. Some days, I'd stand in the break room at the warehouse, staring at the old vending machine, wondering how the hell this became my life. My coworkers were a mixed bag. Most of them were older guys who'd been there for years, and they had this weird mix of pity and amusement toward me. "Kid, you're wasting your time here," one of them said while we were unloading a truck together. "You should be in college or something, not breaking your back for peanuts." "I'm working my way there," I'd reply, wiping sweat from my face. They usually didn't have much to say after that. But it wasn't just the physical grind that wore me down. It was the mental exhaustion of constantly trying to juggle everything. I'd sit in class, trying to focus on the professor's lecture, but my mind would wander to my next shift, or how I was going to afford textbooks for the next semester. Then, of course, there were the little reminders from my parents that they didn't really see what I was going through. One evening, after a particularly rough day at the warehouse, Mom cornered me in the kitchen. "When are you going to start thinking about something more stable, Eric? Maybe business school? Or accounting? Med school is a big risk, you know." I stared at her, too tired to argue. "I'm already in pre-med, Mom. I've got it under control." She sighed like I just told her I was dropping out to become a street performer. "I just don't want you to regret this." Regret? The only thing I regretted was relying on them for support in the first place. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was the accident. I was in the middle of a shift, carrying a heavy box across the warehouse floor, when I stepped on a patch of spilled oil. My foot slipped, and I went down hard. The box landed on my ankle, twisting it in a way that made me scream out loud. I couldn't stand up, and no one rushed to help. The manager eventually wandered over, muttered something about watching where I'm going, and called someone to cover my shift. No ambulance, no concern, just a "you're slowing us down" attitude. I hobbled out of there and managed to get to a walk-in clinic on my own. The doctor told me I'd sprained my ankle pretty bad and would need to stay off it for a few. That was hilarious because staying off it wasn't an option. When I called Mom to tell her what happened, hoping for maybe a little sympathy, she barely reacted. "That's too bad," she said, her tone flat. "By the way, Ashley's thinking about upgrading her car. Maybe you can help her find a good deal?" I hung up the phone without even saying goodbye. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I couldn't work, which meant no paycheck, and my savings took a massive hit just trying to cover rent and food. I tried to focus on school, but the stress of not knowing how I'd make ends meet was overwhelming. My parents didn't offer to help, of course. And Ashley? She didn't even notice. Looking back, that accident was a turning point for me. It was when I realized just how little I mattered to them. But instead of breaking me, it pushed me harder. If they didn't care, fine. I didn't need their help or approval. I just needed to keep going. And I did. By the time my ankle healed, I was barely hanging on. My savings were drained, my credit card was maxed out, and I was behind on rent. The sprain had put me out of work for weeks. And as much as I hated that warehouse job, losing it made me realize just how much I depended on those paychecks. I went back as soon as I could walk again. Limping into that dusty, noisy building felt like defeat. But what choice did I have? I needed the money, plain and simple. My first day back, one of the managers made some sarcastic comment about me taking a nice vacation. I didn't even reply. I just got back to work. Physically, I was weaker than before, but mentally, something had shifted. I wasn't just going through the motions anymore. I had this fire in me, this constant reminder that I couldn't stop. If I gave up now, I'd be stuck in that warehouse forever, just like some of the guys who'd been there for 20 years. Still, the grind was relentless. I'd go from 10-hour shifts to late-night studying sessions in my cramped apartment, surviving on instant noodles and caffeine pills. My social life was non-existent. Friends from high school would text me sometimes, asking if I wanted to hang out or grab a drink, but I always turned them down. Can't, I'd say. Work and school. They eventually stopped asking. Meanwhile, my family was as clueless as ever. I didn't bother telling them about my struggles because, honestly, what was the point? The few times I'd opened up to them in the past, it always ended with some condescending comment or a complete lack of interest. One night, after a particularly brutal shift, I got home to find a voicemail from Mom. "Hi, Eric. Just checking in. Oh, and Ashley's been looking at apartments downtown. She's so excited. It's going to be pricey, but she deserves it after everything she's accomplished." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. What had she accomplished exactly? Driving her fancy Jeep to yoga classes and brunch? Meanwhile, I was busting my ass every single day, and they couldn't care less. At work, I started noticing how some of the older guys moved, slow, stiff, like their bodies were barely holding up after years of abuse. It freaked me out. Was that going to be me if I didn't get out of here? I used that fear to push myself harder in school. I spent every spare second in the library, cramming for exams and working on assignments. My professors started noticing too. One of them pulled me aside after class one day. "Eric, you're doing great work. Have you thought about applying for scholarships?" I almost laughed. "I've looked into it," I said. "But most of them go to kids fresh out of high school or people with perfect GPAs. I don't really qualify." She nodded sympathetically. "Well, if you need a recommendation, let me know. You're one of the hardest working students I've seen." That little bit of validation meant more than she probably realized. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. Things at home, though, stayed the same. Ashley got her downtown apartment, fully furnished, of course. Mom couldn't stop talking about how independent Ashley was, conveniently ignoring the fact that she was still living off their money. The rare times I went home for dinner, it was like stepping into another world. Ashley would talk about her weekend plans, dinners at expensive restaurants, trips to the spa, while I sat there quietly, too tired to contribute. "You should take a break sometime, Eric," Mom said during one of those dinners. "All that work isn't good for you." I couldn't even respond. The irony of her telling me to take a break while they funded Ashley's vacations was too much. But the silence wasn't just at home. It was everywhere. My phone rarely buzzed, my social media was dead, and I barely spoke to anyone outside of work or school. It was lonely, sure, but I didn't have the energy for anything else. Over the next few months, I slowly started to rebuild. My grades improved, and I managed to save up a little money, though it was nowhere near enough for med school. My life was far from perfect, but I was making progress, and that was enough to keep me going. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from Dad. "Hey, Eric," he said, his tone casual. "How's school?" It caught me off guard. He never called just to check in. It's fine," I said cautiously. "Why?" "Well, your mom and I were talking, and we were wondering if you'd be able to help Ashley out with something." I clenched my jaw. Of course, this wasn't about me. It was never about me. "What does she need?" "She's thinking about getting some new furniture for her apartment," he said. "Maybe you could pitch in a little. You know, family helps family." I laughed bitterly. "Family helps family? That's rich, coming from you." He paused, clearly not expecting that reaction. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've been working myself into the ground for years, with no help from anyone, especially not you. And now you want me to help Ashley buy furniture? Yeah, not happening." I hung up before he could respond. The silence that followed was deafening, but it felt right. After that call with Dad, something clicked in me. I wasn't going to keep bending over backward for people who didn't care whether I sank or swam. If they weren't going to lift me up, fine. I'd lift myself. It wasn't some grand declaration. It was more like a quiet decision to just stop giving energy to people who didn't deserve it. Work was brutal. As always, my ankle had healed, but I could still feel it twinge if I moved the wrong way. I couldn't afford to slow down, though. Every dollar I made went straight into my tuition fund or toward bills. No room for extras, no margin for error. The warehouse didn't get any easier. If anything, it felt harder after my injury. I didn't have the same stamina I used to, and my body felt older than it should. Some nights, I'd sit on the edge of my bed, just staring at my boots, wondering how I'd get up and do it all again the next day. But I didn't have time to feel sorry for myself. Med school applications were coming up, and I had to keep my grades sharp if I wanted a shot. Between shifts at the warehouse and my pre-med classes, I was running on fumes. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Mom still called occasionally, but it was always about Ashley, how she was thriving in her new apartment, how proud they were of her for managing so much responsibility. Responsibility? I wanted to laugh every time I heard that. Ashley's biggest stress was deciding whether to get white or beige furniture for her living room. Meanwhile, I was out here working 2 jobs and barely scraping by. But I didn't say anything. I just kept my head down and focused on what I could control. One day at the warehouse, I had a conversation with one of the older guys, Paul. He'd been there for 15 years and looked every bit of it. Stooped shoulders, calloused hands, and a permanent limp from an old injury. "You're still in school, right?" he asked during a break, lighting a cigarette just outside the loading dock. "Yeah," I said, wiping sweat off my face. "Good," he said, taking a drag. "Get out of here while you can. This place will chew you up and spit you out. Don't be like me." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But his words stuck with me. That week, I started doubling down on my studies. I'd wake up earlier to review notes before work and stay up later to finish assignments. It was exhausting, but I knew it was the only way out. Then came the car breakdown. My 15-year-old sedan, held together by duct tape and prayers, finally gave up on me. It happened in the worst way, too. On my way to a night class, I pulled over to the side of the road and stared at the smoking hood, wondering how the hell I was going to fix this. I called Dad, not because I expected help, but because I didn't know what else to do. "Car broke down," I said. "Any chance you can give me a hand?" There was a pause. Then he said, "Well, you know I'm not great with cars. Maybe Ashley can drive you to work for a while." I hung up. The idea of asking Ashley for anything made me want to gag. I ended up walking the last 2 miles to class that night, arriving drenched in sweat and late enough to miss half the lecture. I sat in the back, fuming, not just about the car, but about the fact that I couldn't even count on my own family for basic support. That weekend, I worked a few extra shifts to scrape together the cash for a cheap repair. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it got the car running again, and that was all I needed. What surprised me most during this time was how little I heard from my parents. After that last call with Dad, it was radio silence. No, "How are you doing?" No, "Do you need help?" Just nothing. It was almost laughable. One night, while I was cramming for an exam, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mom. "Hope you're doing okay, Eric. By the way, Ashley's thinking about a trip to Europe next summer. She's so excited." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. It wasn't even worth replying. Despite everything, I kept pushing forward. Every time I wanted to quit, I thought about guys like Paul, trapped in the warehouse because they didn't have a way out. I thought about the nights I spent walking to class or eating ramen for the 5th time that week. And I thought about Ashley, coasting through life with her parents cheering her on, while I fought for every inch. It wasn't fair, but it fueled me. When I finally got my acceptance letter to med school, it felt surreal. After years of grinding, I was finally on the path I'd dreamed of since I was a kid. I sat in my tiny apartment, holding the letter in my hands, and let myself cry for the first time in years. But I didn't tell my parents. What was the point? They'd find a way to make it about Ashley, like they always do. Instead, I celebrated alone, knowing that this win was mine. I'd earned it, not with their help, but in spite of their indifference. And that felt better than anything they could have said or done. I hadn't heard much from my parents after getting into med school. They didn't call to congratulate me, which wasn't surprising, and I didn't bother sharing the news. I had learned the hard way that my victories didn't mean much to them, unless Ashley could somehow get a share of the spotlight. So imagine my surprise when Mom called one evening. I was in the middle of reviewing for an upcoming anatomy exam, trying to memorize terms that sounded like a foreign language, when my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Eric, how are you? We've missed you so much," she started, her voice sugary sweet, like she was about to ask for a favor. I leaned back in my chair, already bracing myself. "What's up, Mom?" "Well," she said, dragging out the word, Ashley's wedding is coming up, and we've hit a little financial snag. Things are just so expensive these days, and we were hoping you could pitch in a bit. You know, family helping family. I actually laughed, like I couldn't help it. You want me to help pay for Ashley's wedding? Yes, she said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. It's her big day, Eric. It's important to her. The absurdity of it all hit me at once. Mom, you wouldn't even help me pay for med school, but now you want me to fork over money for Ashley's wedding? Do you hear how insane that sounds? She sighed, like I was being difficult. It's not about that. You're doing well now, and Ashley's always been there for you. I cut her off. Always been there for me? When? Please. Tell me when she's ever been there for me. There was silence on the other end, followed by her trying to guilt trip me. Eric, this is about family. We all have to make sacrifices for each other. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. Funny how the sacrifices always seem to come from me. The answer's no, Mom. I'm not helping. Her tone shifted immediately. I didn't realize you were so selfish. That was it. I hung up. I wasn't about to sit there and let her twist this into me being the bad guy. A week later, Ashley called me herself. I stared at her name on the screen for a few seconds before deciding to pick up. Better to deal with it directly than let this drag out. Hey, Eric, she said, her voice overly sweet. Mom told me you're not helping with the wedding. What's going on? I couldn't help but laugh again. What's going on? Ashley, are you serious? You've been handed everything your whole life, and now you expect me to throw in money for your big day? No way. Her tone shifted immediately. Look, I get that things haven't always been fair, but this is different. This is my wedding. It's about family. I snapped. Family? Don't even start. Where was family when I was busting my ass to pay for school? Where was family when I needed help? You've had everything handed to you, Ashley. Everything. Don't sit there and lecture me about family. She huffed, clearly annoyed. Maybe if you weren't so bitter, things could be different. That one stung, but I didn't let her see it. You know what, Ashley? You're right. I am bitter. Bitter because I've had to work for everything while you've coasted through life. But at least I can stand on my own 2 feet. Can you say the same? There was a long pause before she said, You're unbelievable, and hung up. I blocked her number right after that. I didn't need her drama in my life. For the next few weeks, I didn't hear from either of them, which was a relief. But then, one evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Mom standing there, looking like she'd been crying. Great. Eric, can we talk? She asked. I let her in, mostly because I didn't want her causing a scene in front of my neighbors. She sat down on my couch and immediately started with the guilt tripping. You know, your sister isn't perfect, but she's still your sister. Family is supposed to support each other. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. Mom, I've been supporting myself my whole life. Where was the family support when I needed it? She launched into the same tired excuses I'd heard 100 times. We were doing the best we could. Things were tight back then. Stop, I said, cutting her off. You weren't doing your best. You made choices. You chose to help Ashley and leave me to figure it out on my own. And I did. But don't come to me now, years later, asking for favors like nothing happened. She looked genuinely hurt for a moment, but then she said, I just don't understand how you can turn your back on your own sister. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm not turning my back on her. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. And honestly, it's about time someone in this family did. She didn't stay much longer after that. When she left, I felt a mix of emotion. Relief that I stood my ground, but also anger that she still didn't get it. A few weeks later, I saw a picture of Ashley's wedding on social media. It was everything you'd expect. Extravagant venue, designer dress, the whole 9 yards. The caption read, Wish you could have been there, Eric. Still love you, though. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. For once, I felt like I was finally putting myself first, and it felt damn good. After Ashley's wedding came and went, the silence from my family was deafening. It wasn't the kind of silence where you wonder if something's wrong. It was the kind where you finally feel some peace. No texts, no calls, no random guilt trips disguised as checking in. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking around with a weight on my chest. I wasn't mad about missing the wedding. Honestly, I'd barely thought about it. From the pictures I saw online, it looked like the typical over-the-top event you'd expect from Ashley. Everything was flashy and curated for Instagram, right down to the choreographed first dance. About a month later, though, my phone rang, and it was Dad. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Hey, I said, trying to keep it short. Hey, Eric, he started, his tone quieter than usual. I just wanted to say, I wish things hadn't gone this way. We didn't mean to make you feel like you didn't matter. I waited. I could tell there was more coming. But, he continued, your sister needed us, and we did what we thought was best at the time. There it was, the same excuse I'd heard 1,000 times. I sighed, not even angry anymore, just exhausted. Dad, I don't hate you. Or Mom. Or even Ashley. But I can't pretend like nothing happened. You made your choices, and I've made mine. He was quiet for a few seconds, then said, I get it. I really do. I just hope one day we can all be close again. Maybe, I replied. But it's going to take time. We hung up after that, and I realized something. For the first time, I didn't feel like I needed their approval. I wasn't chasing their validation anymore. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I'd built my life without them, and I was proud of that. Over the next few months, I focused on med school. It wasn't easy, it never had been, but it felt different now. I wasn't carrying the same bitterness I used to. I was just doing my thing, working hard, and letting everything else fall away. Ashley didn't reach out again after the wedding, and I was fine with that. Every now and then, I'd see her posts pop up on social media, pictures from some tropical vacation or a new designer bag she'd just bought. It didn't sting the way it used to. Instead, it felt more like watching a stranger's life unfold. Mom eventually tried to reach out too, but her attempts were half-hearted. A random text here or there, usually something like, hope you're doing well, or we miss you. I'd reply with a polite, thanks, I'm good. But that was the extent of it. I wasn't ready to reopen those doors, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. The truth is, I didn't need their involvement in my life to feel whole anymore. I had my own goals, my own successes, and my own sense of self-worth. Sure, it hurt that my family had let me down so many times, but I wasn't going to let that define me. One day, while I was on a quick lunch break, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Ashley. The message read, Hey, Eric. I know things have been weird, but I just want you to know I'm proud of everything you've accomplished. Hope we can talk someday. I stared at the message for a while, unsure how to feel. Was she being genuine? Or was this another attempt to smooth things over without actually addressing the problem? In the end, I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't feel like it was my responsibility to fix what they'd broken. If she really wanted to reconnect, she'd have to show it through actions, not just words. A few weeks later, I was at a coffee shop near campus, reviewing notes for an upcoming test, when I ran into one of my old co-workers from the warehouse, Paul, the guy who'd told me not to get stuck there like he had. Eric, he said, squinting at me like he couldn't believe it. That you? Hey, Paul, I said, smiling. He pulled up a chair and we started catching up. I told him about med school, and he told me he'd finally retired from the warehouse. Couldn't do it anymore, he said, shaking his head. My back's shot, and my knees are worse. I felt a pang of sadness for him, but also gratitude for the path I'd taken. You were right, you know, I said, about getting out while I could. I'm glad I listened. He grinned. Good. You deserve better than that place, kid. As I walked home that evening, I thought about how far I'd come. From the kid struggling to keep up with shifts and night classes, to someone who was finally living his dream. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been fair, but I'd made it. And for the first time, I realized I didn't just survive despite my family's neglect. I thrived because I refused to let it hold me back. That was my victory, and it was enough.